Hey there, this is Chicken Fried here. Today I'll be doing a set review over the newest set, Mega Evolutions Pitch Black. This will be a Gym Leader Challenge, also known as GLC, set review. So Gym Leader Challenge, for those of you who may not know, is a fan-made format by Mr. Tricky Jim himself. This means that this set review will not include any rule box Pokemon or trainers that interact with the rule boxes. Also to note that this is a Singleton and Highlander format, so you cannot be playing duplicate cards in a GLC deck. I've broken the set into the following topics: upgrades, potentials, pitfalls, control, and example deck list. Breaking out control, as I feel like control decks typically follow a different playstyle than most GLC decks, so I wanted to touch on those cards separately. Starting off with the upgrades, we got Fomantis and Whalmer. These are strict upgrades of existing cards. Fomantis, now you have a Reckless Charge, so you can donk those 30 HP basics like Badoo, and you can also hit for weakness and snipe for 60 HP basics, which aren't seen as common anymore, but still can come up. And then we got Whalmer here. This Whalmer, although it's the same HP as the old one, for 3 water can do 80 damage. This is more than the old Whalmer, which was 3 colorless for 60 at the cost of 1 extra retreat cost. It's also hard to deny the crochet art for this Whalmer. Definitely pretty cute. Moving on, we got Chi-Yu. So Dark in GLC has been known to be like a middling type. It's kind of just not the best, but not the worst. And I know a lot of players are excited for this Chi-Yu to give a big upgrade to Dark. The attack on Chi-Yu is Spiraling Envy. For a single Dark, it does 20 damage, and if this Pokemon has 2 or more damage counters on it, this attack does 90 more damage, and you don't apply weakness for this attack. So Dark historically has had Hoopa, and in the past, Hoopa and Zapdos have been the premier aggro cards that would take early prizes. And now Hoopa and Zapdos, you take that early prize and they're just stuck in active. In addition, in the card pool, there's so many other good aggressive cards like Fan Rotom and Solrock, which don't have that downside of being stuck in active. With 1 energy, they're able to punch for 70 and KO those 70 HP evolving basics. So now with Chi-Yu, you can hit for 110 for 1 energy, with the stipulation that you need 2 or more damage counters on it. So how can you activate this attack? So Toxtricity exists. I know you wouldn't be as aggressive with it because you would need to evolve into a stage 1, but it provides that reliability in the mid game and late game where you can use the ability, get a dark energy attached to Chi-Yu from the deck, and immediately get the 2 damage counters, so you can hit for 110. In addition, we got Old Cemetery here, and then similar to Old Cemetery, you also have Frozen City. Old Cemetery is probably preferred, so you don't give Psychic. There's pesky damage counters that they can Monkey Dory back to you. Moving along, we have Thievul. So this one's a stage 1, 100 HP Pokemon that has the attack Skill Thief for 2 colorless energy. If you have no cards in hand, choose one of your opponent's attacks and use it as this attack. And so this is a pretty powerful attack. It doesn't have to be your opponent's active Pokemon. As long as they have a Pokemon anywhere on the board, active or bench, you can use their attack. And you can use it in a handful of ways, like a lot of support Pokemon have surprisingly decent attacks like Octillery with Hug. So with Octillery, you can hug them and make it so they can't retreat. Or you can steal some of their best attacks like Guzzlord that can hit for 120 and take an extra prize. Also wanted to pull up these 2 Thievuls. These exist already. They're kind of middling and no one really plays them in Dark, as many of you probably have not seen these before. But I also wanted to call out Nickit, and I think Nickit would be the reason why you would play this Thievul. This Nickit has a pretty powerful attack. For 1 Dark, it has attack Instigate. It reads, your opponent shuffles their hand and puts it on the bottom of their deck. If they put any cards on the bottom of their deck in this way, they draw 3 cards. So for those of you that play Standard, you may be familiar with Special Red card. And that's the effect of this attack. You don't even need to wait for them to be 3 or less prizes. You can just do this turn 2 and special red card them. And I think that's pretty powerful. In addition, Dark doesn't have a lot of card draw, so you could hypothetically get your hand down to 0. It's not too hard. In addition, you have Crobat, which was a recent support Pokemon that came out that can give you anything you want onto the top of your deck, so it's not the end of the world if you go down to a 0 card hand. Moving along, we have Inkay here. So Inkay has the procurement attack. For a single dark, you can search your deck for an item card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. It's not a direct upgrade, so currently there is an Inkay that is 50 HP with the Call for Family attack, but I just wanted to call this out as 60 HP is pretty relevant for basic compared to 50. And then you have some interesting Dark Malamar Pokemon. So on the left, we got Malamar with Entangling Control, which for colorless, you can switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with his or her active Pokemon, and a new active Pokemon is now confused. And then also for a dark, you can hit for 30 and put a card from your discard pile into your hand. That's a pretty strong effect, getting any card you want back into your hand. And then on the right, we got the Hypnotic Rain Malamar, which for a single dark, your opponent reveals their hand. You may discard a Pokemon you find there and use one of that Pokemon's non-GX attacks as this attack. And we were talking about Thievul earlier about how strong it can be to use your opponent's attack. This Malamar, you can take their attack, but not only that, you discard their Pokemon. So if you discard an important Pokemon that they want to use, they're going to have to recover it, which puts extra pressure on their resources. And say your opponent has a small hand, you've taken a look already, and you know there isn't anything great, you have Dark Pressure. For Dark and 2 colorless, you can hit for 80 and discard a top card of your opponent's deck, which could potentially be disruptive. Next, I wanted to talk through Banette. And so, for those of you that may be playing Standard, you're probably pretty excited on the Hide and Sneak deck archetype. And this ability reads, this Pokemon can't be affected by effects or attacks or abilities from your opponent's Pokemon. So what's strong about this is you can't be affected by status conditions, and it provides a sort of bench barrier for you. And with Psychic, this also provides you for 1 dark. Puppet Pool does 80 damage, and you may search your deck for any card and put it into your hand. If you do, shuffle your deck. So it's a very low to the ground aggressive option. Some of these other Banettes. So you have the Curse Words, which is typically played with control decks, and then Puppet Offering, which is typically played with Lost Zone decks. But with these, you have some pretty strong Shuppets to play. You got the Shuppet on the left that has Bleh. For a single Psychic, you can discard a special energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon. And with the rise of special energies, the larger card pool, Black is pretty strong. Psychic's playing special energies, Fighting's playing special energies. You could use Bleh and remove Dark Fighting special energy on Okidogi, and that's effectively doing 100 damage right there. And then the Shuppet on the right has Enveloping Shadow, which does 10 damage for Psychic Energy. And on a coin flip, you can item lock. It's not the best, but you can evolve into Banette from there. And this Puppet Pull attack, I think, is worth considering. Moving along, we got the 2 special energies. For any GLC players that play either Lightning or Dark, you're probably quite excited for these. On the left, we got the Voltaic Lightning Energy, which is reminiscent of Strong Energy for fighting. A plus 20 modifier is extremely strong, as players may know from Muscle Band. And so having this on energy provides a lot of consistency in being able to hit higher numbers. Meanwhile, on the right, we have Shadowy Darkness Energy. And so this energy essentially gives you a bench barrier to one of your Pokemon that this is attached to. And so Dark doesn't have access to this ability, and I think this ability is quite strong, as most types that can use it will play a bench barrier Pokemon. In addition, it provides a special energy, so when you're playing Guzma, you have access to a decent dark energy that is also a special energy. In addition, I'll be touching later on Zarude and why I think it's good, and this synergizes with Shadowy Darkness energy. So, for the interesting considerations, the cards that I think have potential, we're going to start with Zarude. And so Zarude has the first attack reading for a single dark, overhead throw, does 30 damage, and this attack also does 30 to one of your bench Pokemon. What's interesting about this is it can set up your Chi-Yu that we talked about earlier. You set up your Spiritomb. In addition, you can set up your attacks for Guzzlord, as Guzzlord only hits for 120, and having something that can poke a little early is always beneficial. And what I want to talk through for this Pokemon was the Shadow Whip attack, which for 3 dark does 100 damage. And if your bench Pokemon has any Shadowy Darkness energy attached, this attack does 70 more. So you may be wondering, that doesn't seem very exciting. Why would you consider playing this Pokemon? So these are some of the stronger basic Pokemon I could find in Dark that attack. And so starting from the left, you have Yveltal, which has free retreat, can retreat lock, but it's capped at 110 damage. So Viper also 3 energy to use its attack, and it can hit for 180. Granted, you play a single strike supporter. And then on the right, Spiritomb, as we mentioned, can hit hard, but the downfall to Spiritomb is when you're building up damage counters on it, you're susceptible to giving your opponent multi-prize turns, and this can come from Monkey Dory, spread attacks, or just whittling your HP down. So Pokemon with the Delta Plus trait can take multiple prizes without using a TM due to the fact that you have a lower HP. Moving along, we got Marshadow here. And so Marshadow is a 90 HP Psychic Pokemon that for 1 Psychic can do Shadow Knot, and this says the attack does 30 damage times the number of retreat pips in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. And so at first glance, this doesn't seem very exciting for Psychic, right? Psychic doesn't really play with a card like this. But I think what's interesting about this card is it provides Psychic an option to be aggressive. Currently, Pokemon that have a similar kind of attack or synergy all are in grass. So we have the Ariados here, Heracross, and Tangrowth. And so as you see, these are mostly stage 1s, or for Heracross, it requires 2 energy to use this attack. But what's really powerful about this is if you think about the current meta and what are the strongest Pokemon, you have a lot of high retreat cost Pokemon. Whaler has 4, Raging Bolt has 3, we got Snorlax here with 4, Iron Boulder with 3, and so just flipping through these, you're hitting for 90 to 120 just right off the bat. And Psychic doesn't really have that ability to do it outside of Iron Boulder. And so Iron Boulder might be a little bit of a controversial card, given I know a lot of people think it's very strong in Psychic, and it's hard to deny a basic that can hit for 170. But it comes at the cost of hand matching. And when you have to hand match, that means you potentially are unable to advance your board and set it up because you're trying so hard to hit for that 170, which a lot of times just overkills, to be honest. With Marshadow, this is pretty low effort. You have these 2 cards, Gravity Gemstone and Galar Mine, that are pretty beneficial in buffing the attack. In addition, I don't think they hurt Psychic as much as other types, and they're useful all around. So looking on the left, we got Gravity Gemstone, right? So this increases the retreat cost of both active Pokemon by 1. And then on the right, we got Galar Mine, which the retreat cost of both active Pokemon is 2 more. So Gravity Gemstone is essentially a plus 30, and Galar Mine's a plus 60. Looking back on the Pokemon we had here, you're doing a lot more and potentially KOing all these big basics with your single Psychic energy. For Hariyama, you already hit for weakness. For Regidrago and Iron Boulder and Ting Lu, when you're hitting for 90 before, with Galar Mine, you're hitting for 150. And so you're KOing them for a single Psychic. In addition, in Psychic, you probably play switch cards as if you're playing Mew, the Celebrations Mew, you want it inactive and want to be able to pivot it around. And also, Psychic has Mystery Energy, which nullifies essentially Galar Mine by reducing the Pokemon it's attached to. The retreat cost is reduced by 2. So I think it's worth considering Marshadow in these cards in Psychic. Moving along, we got Miraidon here, which I also understand is probably not very exciting, but I think it provides a different way that people can play Lightning outside of spread. The ability Photon Chord reads, if this Pokemon is in the active spot and is knocked out by damage from one of your opponent's attacks, move 2 basic Lightning Energy from this Pokemon to one of your benched Pokemon. And its attack is for 2 Lightning, Thunder, does 90 damage, and this Pokemon also does 30 damage to itself. So this can be pretty aggressive for 2 energy doing 90. Now, as we touched on earlier, you have the Voltaic Energy, which does plus 20. You'll have Electro Power in the type, which does plus 30. And you also have Muscle Band. And so that means not only are you able to KO a lot of the smaller basics and stage ones, but you can also contend with the other bigger basics. And in Lightning, this is pretty strong. Also wanted to touch upon Protection Cube. I think Lightning has some very strong users like Zekrom and Thundurus. They hit hard, and the drawback is you're hitting yourself back hard. And so Protection Cube synergizes well with those, and it has a little synergy with Miraidon, right? Although it's only 30 can rack up, and it can provide better numbers for your opponent. So with Protection Cube, you can nullify that. Also wanted to talk through on that ability where you are able to retain Lightning Energy on the board. So we got Max Elixir and Electric Generator here, right? So you would probably play this in a deck that plays a lot of Lightning Energy, and being able to accelerate these energy onto your board or onto Miraidon, this is pretty helpful, and Miraidon will work to retain those energies on your board. In addition, you have EXP Share and Raichu, which also serve that similar purpose where they can retain energy when your Pokemon outside of Miraidon gets knocked out. And you may be thinking, like, why is it so important to retain this energy on board? One Pokemon that Lightning has gotten but hasn't seen much play is Iono's Kilowattrel. And that's because the ability reads Flashing Draw. You must discard a basic Lightning from this Pokemon in order to use this ability. Once per turn, you may draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. And so what's hard about this card is you have to commit an energy to draw, but it is a strong draw effect. I feel like one of the downfalls to Lightning is Substrika is your best draw engine, and in order to draw with it, you're discarding your hand to draw 4. Not only is 4 a pretty mediocre number, but discarding your hand to draw those 4 cards is rough in a game that is all about resource management. And with Iono's Kilowattrel, this provides you an alternative option so you can keep important cards in your hand and still progress your board and progress through your deck. Moving along, we got Gladian's Decisive Battle. So this supporter has the text, you may only play this card if it is the only card in your hand. And then if it is, it reads, during this turn, attacks used by your Pokemon that do not have a rule box deal 80 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So plus 80 is a very strong modifier. We were raving earlier about why plus 20 was good for Lightning. So this supporter lets you do plus 80, but at the cost of having this as the last card in your hand. We've seen cards like this, like the Archies and Maxies, which require them to be the last card in your deck or in your hand, but they're not really played as much anymore. But I think this is still worth exploring. First thought is probably Squovit, right? You got the Nest Dash ability, which shuffles your hand to the bottom of your deck and you draw 1 card. And if you could play that card, this new Savali that's coming out has the Call a Buddy ability, which can search for a supporter and put it into your hand if you have no cards in your hand. And so This would essentially set up the supporter right. You can play it just like that. I also wanted to touch on Silvally and why I'm not going to talk through it on the rest of this video. Um, I know some players are pretty excited about it, but I honestly think it's quite overrated. Searching a supporter, although is strong, is not really needed for a lot of types, and I think Colorless is one of those that may not need it. The cost of having your hand deleted down to 0 makes it even harder to use because what if you price your Squovit, right? You might not be able to get your hand down to 0 to use that ability. And then we've seen this ability in Dragon, right, with Dragon Knight, and Psychic with Gallade. And both of them aren't really auto includes in their type. Gallade still sees some play, but it's also competing against the Gardevoir that can immediately draw 2. And then for Dragon Knight, it's competing against the other Dragon Knight that can allow your whole board to retreat for free. Moving back to Gladian's Decisive Battle, you also have Festival Grounds, which can allow Seaking and Dipplin to attack twice in a turn. And so that means you get to use Gladian's Decisive Battle's effect twice, right? Because now you're doing plus 80 twice. And so wanted to call out with Dipplin in Grass, you have the Thwacky, which as long as you have a Festival lead Pokemon in the active, you can tutor for any card. Gladian's Decisive Battle, and then in Water you have a similar ability to tutor with Shady Dealings, allowing you to search for any trainer card, including Gladian's Decisive Battle, and if you're able to reduce your hand size down to 0, you can get this and take advantage of that plus 80 modifier. In Grass you also have Jump Bluff, which can attack twice, and also you have this Delta Plus ability. So for Colorless, as we're talking about the Squovin and Silvally, you probably use Swellow to take advantage of the plus 80. So now you don't have to rely on TMs, which in my opinion aren't great for these kinds of attackers. I know a lot of people do use them, but they're dead cards earlier that you have to only use in a very specific situation, and it's a very niche situation, and tools are hard to recover. For Gladian's Decisive Battle, this is a supporter. You can discard it early and via Secret later. You can play Palpad to get it back if you want. And being able to buff the Swellow and Articuno can put them to pretty meaningful numbers where you're able to get that double prize knockout. Moving along, we're going to reach the pitfalls. And so for pitfalls, I just want to put this disclaimer that you can feel free to try these cards. I'm not saying don't play them, but I'm just saying I think they probably will not see as much play or as much success as people may think. And just want to start off on the left with Armarouge. So Armarouge reads for single fire with the Flame Legion attack, it does 40, and then 40 plus for each of your bench Pokemon as a fire energy, it does 40 more. So I think the issue with this Armarouge is you don't really want to spread your energies in fire. If you've played fire before, a lot of the attackers have high energy costs, and so that's why you have Emboar to rain dance those energies onto the attacker, or you have Charizard, which doubles your energies, so you can fulfill these attacking costs. Armarouge here plays in a different direction where you want to spread out those energies, and that's not quite what fire is playing. In addition, if you were to play a deck that wants to spread out your energy, the best combo to work with would be the other Armarouge, which in GLC, unfortunately, you're unable to play. As we touched on earlier, GLC is a singleton format, and so you would only be able to play one Armarouge. Moving along, we got Heatran here. And so I think the key text here is for 2 fire and a colorless, you have the lava wall attack, which does 120, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon doesn't take damage from attacks by Pokemon that are burned. And so what's tough about this is when you're hitting for 120 and burning them, a lot of times you will just knock them out. So that second line of text doesn't really matter a whole lot. In addition, as we were talking about earlier with Armarouge, This requires 2 fire and a colorless, so 3 energy to attack. And that's a pretty steep cost for a deck that, if you're playing like these fire Pokemon to go around that burn synergy, they don't really have that ability to accelerate onto the Heatran as we were talking about earlier, like the Charizard and the Emboar. And then moving along, we got Misty's Energy. And so this card, you just gotta read the first line of text. It says, if you play this card, your turn ends. And so in GLC, even with such a large card pool, I don't think I've ever seen a card played that has that line of text, because ending your turn is a pretty costly effect. Every turn you can only attack once. And so if you end your turn before you're able to attack, you miss out on pretty much any attack that you had set up or any ability that you have. And so what this does though is it gets 4 basic water energy and attaches it to one of your Pokemon. I know people have talked about it for water in setting up your Whale Lord, but the fact with water is you have such good energy acceleration. I don't think Misty's energy is what you need. You have Rain Dance from Baxcalibur and Frostmoth, and with those, you're able to accelerate energy fine enough. Also want to call out that there is Kiawe that currently exists in Fire, and Fire does not have as a prominent energy acceleration as Water, and Kiawe's not even played. So just food for thought there. Moving along, this one might be a little controversial, but I think Toucannon is a pitfall for colorless. It has the ability Sky Draw, which once during your turn you may draw a card. And then for a single colorless, it can attack for Feather Rondo, doing 60 plus, and then its attack does 20 more damage for each bench Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. And so this skill is really hard. You can, if your opponent has a full bench and you have a full bench, you can do 260, which will knock out anything, right? In GLC, when you're not playing Roblox Pokemon, most stage 1 reach or stage 2 reach about 180, and then Whale Lord is 240. I think if you were to look at this card in a vacuum, this card is good, right? The ability is strong, the attack is strong. Although as a stage 2, you would play this. But in colorless, it's a different story. A lot of times you're probably hitting too much that you don't need to, and you're investing cards to get into a stage 2 Pokemon to do that. Drawing once per turn is not bad with the Sky Draw ability, but colorless has one of the best draw engines. Skwovet, Oranguru, Babarrel, Cinccino, Dodrio. You have so many ways to draw that I don't think you would be playing Toucannon to draw. And it also has one of the hardest attackers with Hops Cramorant, Hops Snorlax, just normal Snorlax, that they hit enough numbers that you do not need Feather Rondo to be your attacker. Also wanted to call out that Fire has a similar attacker in Skeledirge, and Skeledirge, although it wants to be played in Fire, is not, just given the consistency that Fire has. In addition, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of times you're going to overkill, and you don't want to waste resources in something that kills more than what is needed. If you have an easier attacker to set up that kills just enough, or KOs, sorry, just enough, you would rather play that. But if you do, I wanted to just call out there's this Trumpbeak that has a Charging Trumpet ability that can accelerate energies. And then there's this Pick-a-Peck that can push your opponent's active Pokemon back to your bench. And there's also a new Pick-a-Peck coming out in the set that has 70 HP. On the right, we have Gwen here, and so Gwen reads, discard up to 2 Pokemon from your hand, excluding Roblox Pokemon, and draw 3 cards for each Pokemon discarded in this way. And so for those of you that may not know, this is a reprint from Roxy, which currently does not see any play in GLC, and that's not to deter you from trying out Gwen. It's just that I think the most optimal Pokemon decks, GLC decks included, would run minimal Pokemon and energies and focus on the strong trainers and supporters and items, as those give you consistency. And so having to discard two Pokemon that you potentially have to recover back now just because you discarded it could be costly. Moving along, we got Seeking here. So it's a stage 1 with 110 HP with the Hydro Jet attack for 3 colorless. This attack does 30 damage for each water energy attached to this Pokemon to one of your opponent's Pokemon. And so a thing to call out here is it can snipe your opponent's bench Pokemon, but Water has Kyogre, which is a basic Pokemon with more HP at 140. And although it costs 1 more energy for 3 water and a colorless, this attack does 180 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon at the cost of putting 3 energy back to your hand. And so you may be thinking, okay, I have to put this energy back in my hand and put it back down. So there is a cost to this, but in my mind, this is actually a benefit because if your Kyogre gets knocked out, you have the energy in hand to re-accelerate it now. You don't have to spend resources to recover this from the discard. In addition, as we discussed earlier, Water has Baxcalibur and Frostmouth to Rain Dance, and you also have Blastoise, the older Blastoise, if you wanted to also play a second Rain Dancer. So you're not really hurting to play energies from your hand to your Pokemon. Moving on, we got Manectric. And so for Manectric, it has the attack Flash Barrier for 2 lightning. It does 50 damage. During your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's evolution Pokemon. And then for 3 lightning, it does Sonic Edge for 110. And this attack's damage isn't affected by effects on your opponent's active Pokemon. So Flash Barrier from a glance could look pretty interesting, right? It prevents all damage done from your opponent's evolution Pokemon. But just the way that GLC is shaping up with the card pool, with the power of cards that Pokemon is printing, it's going towards a lot of big basics, and it makes sense. It's easier to recur a basic Pokemon attacker than multiple Pokemon to evolve back into your attacker that requires evolutions. And so as a result, Flash Barrier I don't think will see a lot of use. And then Sonic Edge 3 for 110 isn't great, but I will give the caveat that this allows you to knock out the fighting Marshadow that, if it takes a knockout, is invincible. In addition, with this set, you have the new Electrike that has Collect. And so for single lightning energy, you can collect, and it's also 70 HP. Moving along, we got Bastiodon, and so Bastiodon has the ability Ancient Bulwark. It reads, while this Pokemon is on your bench, prevent all damage done to your Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon that have 2 or fewer energy attached. In addition, it has the attack for 2 metal and a colorless, Hammer In for 160. And so the ability is, at a first glance, pretty strong also, right? You can pretty much nullify your opponent's attackers, and then for 3 energy, hitting for 160 in GLC, that's pretty strong too. However, I wanted to emphasize that first line of text where it says, while this Pokemon is on your bench. That means if your opponent can gust up this Pokemon, it just nullifies this ability. And it has 4 retreat, so if you didn't have this Pokemon ready to attack when they bring it up, it might be stuck in active. And in addition, you have other means to get through, like Hex Maniac, so that just kind of makes it a little harder. In addition, this is a fossil Pokemon, and the downfall of the fossil Pokemon, I think, is you cannot recur fossils easily. They're item cards, not Pokemon, so you usually play item cards that can recover Pokemon, and you would need it to get the Shieldon and Bastiodon, but you would require a different card to get your fossil back. In addition, Fighting had received Tyrantrum, which I think is a stronger card. And even then, this Tyrantrum doesn't see as much play in Fighting, given just the strength that Fighting is and has, and the gameplay that it plays where it's very aggressive and this doesn't align with it. Moving along, we got the control cards. And so for here, I just want to cover each of these cards and why. and what a control player would want to play. So starting with Dark Bell, it says both active Pokemon are now confused. So this is similar to the card Yellowhorn, which just read both active Pokemon are now confused. And so if you were to play this, it's worth having that coin flip where if your opponent wants to attack, they can flip a coin and potentially not do anything. Um, but yeah, I don't play a lot of control decks that do play this card, but I will say it's worth considering. Next up, we got Rust Syndicate Grunt, which has this important text that reads, "You may only play this card if one of your Pokemon was knocked out during your opponent's last turn." And so, what's hard about this card is when you're playing control, you don't want to constantly give up prizes. You want to give up prizes to the point that you stabilize, and then you want to just control the game. But with this card, if you're playing it to deny energy, you have to constantly give up knockouts. And so there's a way that you can do it with the Pokédolls and RoboSub, but most of the time, if you were to play energy removal, there's Plumeria and Team Flare Grunt, which each has its own uses. Plumeria can discard energy from anywhere, and Team Flare Grunt, without the cost of discarding two, can do it from the active. Moving along, we got Primarina, which has the ability Max Melody, and that reads, "You may use this ability once during turn when you play this card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon. Heal all damage from one of your Pokemon." And then for Water and Colorless, Aqua Return does 120, and return this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your hand. For Primarina, it doesn't have to be for a control deck, but I think this is a very strong effect with a strong attack to go with it. The Aqua Return attack synergizes with the fact that you have to play Primarina from your hand to evolve to get that ability off. And if you can loop it with which Water has a lot of big Pokemon like Whale Lords, Titan, and Wishy Washy, you could play a stall heal deck related to that. And then lastly, we got Jinx here. This Pokemon has the Wicked Kiss attack for Psychic Energy, and it reads, "At the end of your opponent's next turn, discard the defending Pokemon and all cards attached to it." And so, what makes this card interesting is when you're playing control, you usually want to have more prizes than your opponent. This is so you can use a lot of those comeback cards that require you to have more prizes than your opponent. But also, if you have 6 prizes, if you play Lily's Determination, you can still draw 8 cards. But also, when you're playing control, sometimes there are Pokemon that can ruin your strategy and you want to remove it. And so sometimes these control decks do play ways to knock out Pokemon. But with Jinx here, this provides you an option to remove your opponent's Pokemon without taking a prize. And so Wicked Kiss, if you want to run your opponent out of resources like switching, you can slowly get rid of all their Pokemon. You can, as we talked about earlier with the Galar Mine and the Gravity Gemstone, keep your opponent stuck in the active and just knock out their Pokemon. In addition, for control decks, you're usually playing pretty scrappy games, and Psyshock for a Psychic Colorless does 50 damage, and on a coin flip, you can paralyze, which is pretty good and will probably come up if you do play this in a control deck. Alrighty, moving on to the example deck idea I wanted to present. For those of you that were listening along, you probably were thinking, I haven't talked about Fossil Excavation Site. And so if you're interested in fossils like the Bastiodon, the Tyrantrum, you're probably, or even Archeops and Colorless, you're probably wondering, where's this card? Like, I haven't touched on it. And so this card is reminiscent of Pokemon Research Lab, which has been banned in GLC. And Pokemon Research Lab got you 2 Pokemon that evolved from unidentified fossil and put them onto your bench, and then if you did, your turn ends. Fossil Excavation Site reads, once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for up to 2 trainer cards with Antique in their name and put them onto their bench and shuffle your deck. And I think this card's very good, not because of the fact that you can get 2 fossils and the fossil Pokemon that evolve from it, but because of this Pokemon right here, Relican. And Relicanth reads for a colorless Fossil Beatdown 10 plus. This attack does 30 more damage for each of your bench Pokemon with Antique in its name. And so how I see it is Relicanth can provide a very aggressive attacker to water, similar to what Fan Rotom does, where if you have a stadium, and in this case Fossil Excavation Site, you can punch for 70 on turn 1 for a single energy. In addition, there's actually some pretty interesting fossil cards, antique fossil cards. So on the bottom, I called out probably the most interesting, and I think these would be what you play. Antique Root Fossil has the Primal Root ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, attacks used by your opponent's basic Pokemon costs colorless more. So that can slow down aggressive decks if you don't have a strong opener. Antique Jaw Fossil has the ability Intimidating Jaw. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon do 30 less damage. And so this is strong against spread decks like Lightning Spread, where Tapu Koko does 20 to all your Pokemon. You have Electivire does 50. If you were to have Antique Jaw Fossil in the active, their Tapu Koko will be doing 0 for its flying flip, and Electivire, instead of spreading 50, will be doing 20 like Tapu Koko's attack. In addition, Antique Jaw Fossil essentially effectively has 90 HP. So if your opponent tries to attack for 70 from like Fan Rotom or Solrock, you can tank a hit, and the first paragraph on all of these fossil cards read, this card can't be affected by any special conditions and can't retreat. At any time during your turn, you may discard this card from play. So you can tank a hit and just discard this card and just nullify their attack. Moving along, we got the Antique Sail Fossil, which has the ability Protective Sail. Whenever your opponent plays a supporter card from their hand, prevent all effects of that card done to this Pokemon, so they can't gust it up. And Antique Helix Fossil has the ability Helical Swell. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent can't play any stadium cards from their hand. Lastly, I wanted to call out there's a couple with Bench Barrier if you do want to keep them on the bench for Relicanth when you're using Fossil Beatdown. And then, because you're playing Relicanth, you can play all these water fossil Pokemon. Tortuga has the Ancient Seaweed attack, which does 30x, and 30x is 30 damage for each item card in your opponent's discard pile. And this can rack up really quick. For just 6 items, you can do 180, and that's going to KO probably most Stage 2 Pokemon you see. Caracosta has the ability Mighty Shell. Prevent all damage from and effects of attacks done to this Pokemon by your opponent's Pokemon that have any special energy attached. And this can be a silver bullet to a lot of decks like Colorless, which mostly play special energy. And Aurorus has the Tundra Wall ability. All of your Pokemon that has a water energy attached take 50 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. And that can make your Pokemon very tanky and potentially go for 2-for-1s a lot in the mid game, as your Pokemon will be so tanky that they won't be KO'd immediately and you won't have to trade back and forth constantly. And then lastly, we got Omastar here with the ability Primordial Tentacles. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's active Pokemon can't retreat. So this can be played more in a control and stallish environment. But also the Aqua Split attack for 2 water does 90, and this attack does 30 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon, which is pretty strong too. And so here, this is just an example deck list that I put together. I'm quite excited to play it actually once I get my hands on these new cards. Some things I wanted to call out in this deck are the Shady Dealings line. You got Drizzle and Teleon, and with Shady Dealings, you can get any trainer card. So that includes the Stadium, the Fossil Excavation Site, and you can also get any fossil. And so a lot of times it's hard to evolve these fossil Pokemon. But with Shady Dealings, you can get, for example, Rare Candy and a way to search out Aurorus and immediately get Aurorus out, which is pretty strong. And then you have Cryogonal, which can slow down your opponent if you do have a slower start. And then there is this Lost Zone package with Cramorant, Lost Provisions, Chorus Experiment, Lost Splendor, and Lost Vacuum. And you may see Lost City right here. And so the reason Lost City is played with the Cramorant is not only can it build up your Cramorant, But this deck plays Rescue Scarf and Splash Energy. And those are pretty important for a deck like this, especially when you're trying to play with fossils, because as I talked about earlier, it's hard to recur the fossils. So if you have Splash Energy on Tortuga and you take the KO, and your opponent takes a KO back, you can get both the Antique Cover Fossil and a Tortuga back into your hand. And so I think that's pretty powerful if you want to play fossils and be able to replay them. It's also worth noting Irida can get you your Relicanth and a fossil. Pokestop can actually get you more fossils because they are item cards, and so when you activate Pokestop to look at the next 3 cards, you can get fossils onto your bench. So for those of you that have made it this far, I just want to say thank you. I'm flattered that you've been willing to listen to me rant for 40 minutes. I think GLC has a lot of untapped potential because of the large card pool and the small community that plays along with it. And so that means there's not that many people grinding it like standard, trying to find the most optimal deck. In addition, I just enjoy deck building, and so I wanted to try bringing some unique ideas that maybe people haven't thought of, and maybe people want to experiment and try these new ideas in GLC. So it's been fun treating this kind of like a class presentation, going through a PowerPoint and talking through something I enjoy. Thank you.